John, how are you?
Okay, Terry.
Let me just ask a question now. Tell me about your podcast. Is it devoted to HIV/AIDS, or is it about everything, or what?
The purpose of the podcast is to emphasize the spiritual dimension of life and to seek for the truth in news.
So it is a broad general mission that you have then, and this is just one of the topics that you have talked about in the past, I assume.
It seems to be one I'm focusing on a lot.
Now you're in Perth, is that correct?
Yes,
Do you know the Perth group, the individuals in the Perth group? Have you
I've
met them?
I've met Val. I've had a coffee with him. I haven't met Eleni. I've been in contact with them via phone and email for a few years, but they pretty much keep to themselves.
Yes, I've never met them, even by email. I have not met them. I'm not, and as you'll see when we get into this conversation, I'm I don't take a side on the what I regard as angels on the head of a pen question of isolated or not isolated, for reasons I'll explain.
So, what is the origin of your interest in the HIV/AIDS debate?
I guess I have as we would say in the United States colloquially, I have a dog in this fight. I'm a 64-year-old gay man. I have lived in the Washington, D.C. gay community since I moved to Washington in 1975. And I was in my late 20s, early 30s as the whole thing began to unfold. And interestingly, though my background is as a former newspaper reporter, as a political press secretary, an avid news junkie, I had actually never heard that there was any dissent from the HIV equals AIDS paradigm until less than 5 years ago. And I actually stumbled onto it involving an Australian case, as a matter of fact. It was the case of a man who was charged with wielding a lethal weapon, not notifying a sexual partner of his HIV status. And I happened to see that on a libertarian website in February of 2007. And that site happened to link to aliveandwell.org, the dissident website that was run by the late Christine Majori. And I contacted Christine. I had her to come to Washington to speak to my journalism students. I run a program to teach journalism students about politics. And that began my whole self-educational journey into the mysterious retrovirus and the amorphous AIDS syndrome. So I have not been at this as long as a great many of the people, beginning with Peter Duesberg back in the late 1980s. And I have come to the conclusion that there is not now, there never was, a human immunodeficiency virus. So that's what got me started. It was really by accident. I think I always felt that there at least had to be cofactors involved, even if there were a retrovirus involved. But I no longer believe that. I just don't believe that there is a pathogen that you can call HIV. There might be some viral code that you can call the Terry or the John virus, but it doesn't mean it causes any disease.
Yes,
So
yeah.
that's how I got here.
And so you're a relative newcomer.
Well, it's been 5 years now, and I have read about 20 books, and I've read scores and scores of medical and science journals, popular press articles. And so I have made myself, even though I come from a social science kind of background, as most journalists do, enough of an expert in the cell biology and epidemiology and biochemistry and genetics, all self-taught, to be able to at least speak the language of the people who are medical and scientific experts on this. So I feel well informed, even though I've been at it for less than 5 years.
Oh, you are well informed, I can tell.
Well, I approach it as a journalist would approach it. Journalists are generally generalists, and we know how to investigate. We know how to look for truth. And even though we are not experts on much of anything, you get to the point where you can sort of almost understand intuitively whether something passes the smell test, whether it is likely to be true or whether there are large numbers of anomalies from a theory. And that's what I think I've succeeded in doing by just simply doing the reading. And that's the problem. The entire world, because of the what has become an HIV/AIDS industry on which the United States of America taxpayers have spent over $350 billion in the last 30 years. This industry, which I also call a cult, has made it almost impossible to break through to the general public because, in fact, and this is something I think would be of interest to you, the mainstream media, the MSM as we call it, has kept this information from the public. The industry is so powerful. There is so much money involved in this. There are so many hundreds of thousands of people who make their livings off of this mysterious retrovirus theory that it's almost impossible to make people listen to you. That's the big problem, and I find that with gay men. I try to discuss this with a middle-aged gay man, and he almost says, "Well, you're trampling on the graves of our dead." This single pathogen theory was very welcome. We can get into this by gay men because they really didn't want to face up to the multifactorial explanation for this amorphous syndrome.
Yeah, well, it's a very good summation of the situation in journalism these days. And
yes,
go on.
I certainly, sort of live with this because I teach college journalists who want to be political reporters about politics, and we really have a mixed media culture right now where we have traditional media that attempts to play by some of the rules of the last 100 years, objectivity, fairness, proportionality. But we have so many media outlets, including the television, obviously, but also more particularly the cable news networks, and now the multi-million networks of the internet. And we are finding it harder and harder for consumers of information and news to be able to know where to go for real information that has been vetted for truth. And on the other hand, we have these news organizations and these quasi-news organizations and these non-news organizations who treat information almost for its entertainment value in order to attract audiences, to lease eyes and ears to advertisers. So it's very, very difficult in this kind of media environment to break through to any conventional wisdom. And therefore, when you are talking about something as emotion laden as sex equaling death, two of the things that human beings probably spend a lot of their time thinking about, then you realize what we're up against in trying to break through that. And there's a great propaganda organ right where I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., or at least up in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C., called the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes for Allergy and Infectious Diseases is headed by Anthony Fauci, who has been the face of the HIV equals AIDS myth for 27 years. This man has served, I hesitate to use the word served, he's propagandized the public. He's makes his reputation off of what I think of as psychologically terrorizing gay men and now Black Africans, and promoting the use of highly toxic chemotherapy for life. It seems to, and he is probably, I would call him the chief culprit. He's even worse than Robert Gallo, who the unethical scientist who just made this stuff up. And again, we can get into the details of going back to that history if you'd like. It might be useful at this point to answer the question that always is asked and rightfully asked. Well, okay, if it's not a retrovirus, what is it? So if I can answer my own question, it's really multifactorial. And we knew that at the beginning. Dr. Joe Sonnabend, a doctor in New York City, was one of the first doctors to encounter collapsing immune systems among gay men, actually in the late 1970s in New York. Gay men were coming in to see him with constant and recurring old diseases. And really, what we were seeing at that point was a threefold multifactorial problem. Gay men had come out loud and proud, were living in urban areas, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and were almost as an expression of gay liberation, were sexually, well, we were, not to put too fine a point on it, screwing like bunnies. We were having scores, hundreds, even over a period of time, thousands of sexual encounters. And when you do that, you're coming in intimate contact with another human being, and you can spread old pathogens. It's quite as simple as that. And we were treating those old pathogens, the diseases from them, with way too much antibiotic. And what we were doing was suppressing immune systems. Secondly, our lives were centered around gay bars, clubs, lots and lots of alcohol, higher incidence of smoking tobacco than the general public, amphetamines, cocaine in the late 70s, and poppers, these nitrites that are really very poisonous, and all of those things are immune suppressive. And third, we were becoming a hated minority as the religious right in America was rearing its head. We had come from small towns, rural areas, merging into city life, and we were isolated from family, suffering from depression, isolation, and particularly stress. And we know, as a fact from neurobiology, that stress has hormonal influences on our natural immunity. So you stir those things together: exposure to old pathogens, ingestion of toxins, and the psychogenic effects of being a hated minority. And you had a certain small percentage of immune systems start collapsing among gay men in a way that an insurance company, an actuary, someone who calculates morbidity and mortality, could understand. But that was not, and I'll end this story, satisfying to gay men. Gay men did not want to believe that. They wanted to believe this was everybody's disease. It could be everybody's disease. They really were open to the idea of a 19th century germ theory explanation. And along comes Robert Gallo at the Cancer Institute in the US and Luc Montagnier at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. They'd been working a dozen years, frustrated, couldn't find any of their retroviruses could cause cancer. That was their research. So, voila, all of a sudden they embrace this new mysterious disease and say to themselves, well, maybe it's one of our retroviruses. And that's how the myth got started. Unscrupulous researchers and gay men wanting a simple explanation for a complex problem. To make a long story short, that's how we got the what I call the greatest myth in the history of medicine, and I think the most dangerous. I think it borders on genocide.
Thank you, Terry. That was a great explanation for the listeners. Chronologically ordered, actually. So, yeah, very good.
I think the only part of it I left out was that this all began with the sexual revolution of the 1960s, and it was a dozen years into it that this was occurring, and you could have almost predicted it would occur, and that something like this would occur, as Joe Sonnabend, a South African, as a matter of fact, who was practicing medicine in New York City, I think was the first to understand this.
Yes, and I think Gottlieb was the other chap who encountered these
Yes,
cases.
Michael Gottlieb in, I guess, Los Angeles. I believe he was in Los Angeles.
Yeah, but he stayed on the mainstream side of the fence rather than Sonnabend.
Yeah, I think Sonnabend has been sort of wavering a little in the last decade or so. He does believe that there is some role for HIV, but he is a real skeptic, for example, of overuse, premature use, as he would put it. I think any use is premature use of the nucleoside and nucleotide and protease inhibitors, as they're called technically. And he sees the damage that can be done from this chemotherapy for life. and he is very, very cautious about it. Interestingly, another one of the so-called pioneers of HIV, Dr. Jay Levy at the University of California at San Francisco, who's sometimes called the third co-discoverer of HIV, has a similar view. He believes that you should not use these drugs until as a last resort.
Yeah. However, people are eating them like licorice all sorts, or they have been, especially during that period when ACT UP were very active and the medicine was a lot stronger, the amount of AZT.
In fact, ACT UP, by demanding virtually that our Food and Drug Administration, which was already moving into the pockets of the pharmaceutical industry, it demanded fast tracking of this drugs. And as a result, now there has been very problematic fast tracking of all kinds of drugs for all kinds of diseases. And it's coming home to roost here, and that we're seeing all kinds of well, they call them side effects, but that's a euphemism for adverse effects of all kinds of drugs that have been fast-tracked without proper clinical trials, or clinical trials that are phony, that are conducted by the very people who will benefit economically from them. The so-called HIV drugs are now a $15 billion annual industry. And just for comparison,
not bad.
That's just, and the largest producer of them is a company called Gilead Sciences in near San Francisco, as a matter of fact. And just for comparison, I checked the numbers. I compile those numbers by going to the annual reports of the big drug companies. And then I went to the annual reports of the makers of Cialis, Viagra, and Levitra, and they sell $5 billion a year, the extremely popular so-called erectile dysfunction drugs. Only 1/3. And the sector for these HIV drugs continues to grow, and the worst perpetrator here is Gilead Sciences. They are promoting these drugs along with Anthony Fauci at the National Institutes of Health, and trying to get gay men and African women to take these drugs when they are HIV negative. That is, when they test non-reactive to the set of proteins that are wrongly called an HIV test. And I think this just borders on genocide.
Yeah, I heard about that drive to promote antiretrovirals amongst the HIV negative people.
It's because these are huge money makers. And I'll tell you how these companies make the money in the United States. They get the government to pay for all the HIV drugs. Therefore, they can pump up the price of something that probably costs them $100 or $200 to make for a year's supply to $10,000 or $12,000 a year.
Really?
And what they're doing is they take money from these drug companies, they put it into nonprofits that are set up as shells to hand out money to people who are talked into using these drugs to make the co-payment to the U.S. government's 80% payment. So the drug company gives $2,000 to, in effect, an unwitting patient. That patient gives that $2,000 to the to his pharmacy, and the federal government gives $10,000 to the pharmacy over a year, and then the money goes to back to the drug company, maybe netting a profit of $8,000 or $9,000 a year. It's a scam. It's an incredible scam, and they are advertising in gay publications, in billboards. And here in Washington, you can go into the subway station and see their advertisements. You can see a shirtless gay male on a full-page ad in a gay newspaper with a tattoo on his chest saying, "My body is telling me my T cells have dropped below 500. It's time to take the drugs." It is so unethical, and how at the same time so difficult to get gay men to understand that they're being used as guinea pigs, and Africans the same way.
It's a very successful self-perpetuating industry.
It's chemotherapy for life. In fact, part of the advertising is you can't miss a single dose because this retrovirus changes its shape. Well, if it's changed its shape over 30 years, um, what is it? That's the whole argument, that here it morphs and is constantly morphing into something else. So what is it? Tell me what this 9,000 or 10,000 base pair um, genome is that's written in nucleic acid and wrapped in a little protein. If it's constantly morphing, uh, is it the same thing as 30 years ago? 30 years ago, when it was first started being noticed and the panic set in, you were told you had a month or two to live or several months to live. Now you're told, okay, well, maybe 8 years or 10 or 12 or 20 or maybe the rest of your life.
And that was true in a way. They didn't have long to live because of the high dosage of AZT taken in
That
those
came along in
days.
1987. And the first 6 years of the AIDS scare, perhaps 2 or 3,000 men were dying a year in the United States. And then AZT comes along in 1987, and tens of thousands of people have been poisoned and killed by those high doses. And then by the mid 1990s, you had certainly AIDS patients, people who had been made ill either through the multifactorial route that I explained, or from the poisonous AZT. They were then given what were in effect weaker, less poisonous drugs, and they were so far down it looked like up to them. That was the so-called Lazarus effect of these drug cocktails that came along in the mid 90s. And then it was during that time when all hell broke loose, and anybody who tested HIV positive was told to hit hard, hit early by the loony Dr. David Ho. And that's really what started the process that now has ended up in the deaths from liver disease, kidney dysfunction, heart attacks, all kinds of body changes, chronic diarrhea, all of the impact of this chemotherapy for life that has so damaged the health. If your listeners want to take a look at the physical damage that's done, I have a special report at my website, terrymichael.net, terrymichael.net, that shows a video of the faces of the New York men that have been wasted by this chemotherapy for life. It really is tragic. I don't like to overstate as a journalist. I like to be as accurate as I can, but in many ways, this is almost comes up to an unintended genocide.
It looks that way.
And we're just talking Africans into believing that their old diseases, malaria and tuberculosis, their lack of clean drinking water with all of its pathogens, their malnutrition, all the things that add up to compromised immune systems, which is why a great percentage of African children don't make it past the age of 5. They haven't developed strong immune systems. And we just write it off to HIV too. We couldn't make white heterosexuals get this mysterious AIDS. There never was an AIDS epidemic among white heterosexuals in the West. But therefore, the drug companies just decide to offshore this disease and call it HIV-2 in Africa so that they could pump this chemotherapy for life into the bodies of third world people.
Yeah, it's a bad situation.
So, we have a group of people around the world, including, as you know, obviously in Perth, the Perth group, and a group called Rethinking AIDS, but a lot of individual researchers like myself who have done the reading. You really cannot understand this without doing the reading, and very, very few people are willing to devote the time to it or even know that the information is there. Again, as a trained journalist, as somebody who is a news junkie, I didn't know until 5 years ago. But once you do the reading, once you start going, farther and farther down this rabbit hole, the stranger and stranger it gets. How we could have, for a quarter of a century now, 27 years actually, since April 23, 1984, when the United States government announced to the world the probable cause of AIDS has been found. By the next day in the New York Times, it was the cause of AIDS. It's just amazing how for 27 years this has taken off. But if you look underneath all of this, it's really about money, and it's about fear and greed.
Definitely. And the exploitation of fear.
I think that
because of the greed.
As somebody who worked 16 years as a political press secretary, I know a lot about how fear is used as a weapon by politicians. That's how we got the war in Iraq. We lost our Cold War bet noir, the Soviets, so we picked up the terrorists, an amorphous enemy, to allow us to feed the very greedy military-industrial complex in the United States. Mm-hmm. And the fear of sex equaling death feeds the greed of international pharmaceutical companies. It's just amazing. Think about that, $350 billion spent by the U.S. government alone. That means that a lot of people are getting a lot of their livings made out of this fraud.
So you have two organizations going up against it, Rethinking AIDS and the Perth Group.
Yes, and you know, there's this sort of a conflict that I've never got myself involved in because I don't think it matters. And it's the question: has a virus ever been isolated through proper scientific techniques? Peter Duesberg, the retrovirologist who was the first to challenge the theory in 1986, 2 or 3 years into it, says yes, there is a viral code, but it's a harmless passenger virus. That there are thousands of harmless retroviruses. None has ever been has been proved to cause a disease. The Perth Group, on the other hand, said no, there is no proof that there's ever been any virus isolated. To me, I understand why scientists argue over that, but as a practical matter, as a more practical person here, I'm interested in, is there a pathogen, whether it's been isolated or not isolated? If there is no pathogen, and as a practical matter, it doesn't mean much in terms of trying to protect people from the psychological terrorism of this single pathogen theory and having their health destroyed through this chemotherapy for life. So I focus on the latter. I don't really get into the details of this argument from the Perth Group or from Peter Duesberg, Rethinking AIDS, or the Perth Group. Again, I understand why, as scientists, they want to make these arguments, but as a practical matter, I'd rather just address the question of, is there a pathogen? And I've come to the clear conclusion there's not. So let's warn people that they shouldn't be scared to death, and they shouldn't be drugged to death with the biggest fraud in medical history.
Is that why you became allied with Rethinking AIDS, in order to, via the podcast, get the message across to? Yes,
I I co-hosted the podcast with the president of Rethinking AIDS, David Crow of Calgary, Alberta. David he's actually a businessman who just got interested in this. Heterosexual man, wife, 2 kids, just started reading about it and got interested and started doing the research. And he aligned himself with the Rethinking AIDS group. I think he had a different name from the beginning. And then somehow Rethinking AIDS got into an argument with the Perth Group. I think it was over that case that brought the whole thing to my attention. And they've been sort of at war since then. But
Which the Chad Perenzi case, you mean?
yes, I can't remember the name of
Yeah, yeah.
but that is, I think that's the source of a lot of the anger that goes back and forth between Rethinking AIDS and the Perth Group. I respect both organizations. I had begun to work at the beginning of this year with Rethinking AIDS on trying to set up a conference in Washington, D.C., since I consider this ground zero for the fraud because of the National Institutes of Health being located here. And I wanted to reach out to the gay community here, large gay community, and large African American community. But we ended up having a difference of opinion, and Rethinking AIDS wanted to make the conference more about the rethinkers around the world coming together. So I simply decided that my desire to work on this really wasn't being fulfilled, or at least my purpose wasn't being fulfilled, which was to do an outreach to people who actually were like me 5 years ago and don't know anything about the questions. So I, in September, sort of gave up on trying to change the direction of the conference and just sort of said, well, I'm going to go ahead and have your conference, but I want to go in a different direction. I really hope to. I've done some writing on this that's been published. It's almost impossible to get published any questioning of the theory in mainstream media. But because my history is I have been involved in journalism and politics. I used to be press secretary for the National Democratic Party back in the 1980s. And I run a mainstream journalism education program. So I was hoping I could bring those kind of mainstream credentials to the argument, insofar as there is an argument, because it's hard to have an argument if you can't talk to the general public about it, and that's nearly impossible to do through mainstream media. But the internet has allowed some conversation to take place increasingly over the last 10 to 15 years. But frankly, we have a long way to go. The only world leader who's ever had the courage to take this on was Thabo Mbeki in South Africa, and there was nothing in it for him politically. He just was a smart man who did the reading and said this is white medicine men trying to, in effect, portray Black Africans as sexual maniacs. And he understood what was going on, and he tried to fight it, but the white medicine men beat him, at least temporarily.
Temporarily. At this point, Terry, I'd like to thank you very much for the How Positive Are You podcast, certainly your contribution to it. I don't think I missed an episode. It is really, or was, and probably still is, a brilliant source of information for those interested in this debate. And
we tried to interview most of the dissidents and a lot of people who actually were suffering from this. Celia Farber, who did great work on this for about 20 years as a journalist, was one of the co-hosts before me, and then the founder of it was Christine Majority, who really was a wonderful human being, and she really, for a decade and a half, cast a lot of light on this, and I use her as my inspiration.
Yeah, me too.
And I want to thank you and a number of other people who do shows like yours for making a broader audience aware of this lie, of this huge, huge lie. This is sort of Hitlerian in the big lie technique. It seems so impossible to believe that for 27 years the world has been wrong on this, but history is replete with examples of how science has gone wrong. Just ask, if you could, Galileo and the Catholic Church's insistence for centuries that the sun revolved around the earth, and it's in the same category. I always like to quote Pasteur. Pasteur was, of course, you could call him the founder or the father of the single pathogen theory of disease. On on his deathbed, and this might be apocryphal, but I think not. He said, Bernard, I think I got his nemesis name correct, is correct. The pathogen is nothing. The terrain is everything. By which he meant that our bodies take care of disease. Doctors don't, chemicals don't, procedures don't. Yes, some of those things can be useful, but for the most part, our natural immune systems take care of us. And the immune deficiency we were seeing was simply a variety of interferences with that natural immunity. It wasn't some new bug.
I saw that on your website. I appreciated the quote. Yeah, the terrain is everything, and that indicates the body has an innate intelligence or self-protective mechanism which should be allowed to function.
I think that we are getting more and more research showing that particularly stress has a huge impact on the immune system. The neurobiologists, like I'm going to forget his name now, Robert, I'm forgetting it. He's at Stanford, and he studied apes. I forgot what type of family of ape, and their social communities, and saw how those in low status were much more subject to disease.
Is that
than
Pribram?
those.
Is that
Pardon?
Carl Pribram? Is that him, or is that
Not
some?
familiar with him. Again, I could think of this. I'll probably think of this before we finish here, but Robert is his first name. And he did this for 20 or 30 years. He's still doing it. And I think, it's common sense. We're always told, well, if you want to get better, get a positive attitude. When you are stressed, under great stress, as again, gay men were in the early 1980s, hormones in your body, stress hormones that were placed there genetically to protect us, to flee from the tiger, are now there every day for minor stresses and play havoc with our health. And the other part that most people don't understand, because we focused on this whole cell-mediated immunity and CD4 T cells and viral loads and really a lot of nonsense, that 70 to 80% of our natural immunity is in our intestinal tract, coming from the microbiota, the microbiome, the good trillions of good bacteria in our guts that help us absorb nutrients and that protect us from pathogens that make it through that intestinal tract. And though most people don't like to hear this description, I'll make it as kind as I can. Gay men engaging in anal sex, at least one end of that tract is under certain kinds of sexual habits, including cleansing enemas of the intestinal tract before anal sex, including sex toys, including a practice called fisting. Really were interfering with that. And on top of all these other factors, there's so many good explanations that we just ignored in the early 1980s because gay men just did not want to hear it. And two, one kind of not very smart and one certainly not ethical researchers just decided to make this whole thing up. I honestly believe that Robert Gallo and Anthony Fauci knew they were making it up. I don't. The more I look into this, the more I believe they probably said, okay, well, look, this will just scare those gay men into having less sex and they'll have less syphilis and less gonorrhea, so it won't hurt anything. That's what I think actually went through their minds when they contrived this theory and propagated it, and then it spun out of control.
Well, they're not going to retract it now, are they?
Gallo is in his 70s and Fauci is near retirement. It's a new movie coming out about J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI with files on all kinds of Americans and sort of held American presidents and politicians at bay. Well, he was an unelected bureaucrat for almost, I suppose, 30 or 40 years. The only other unelected bureaucrat I'm aware of in our federal government is Anthony Fauci, who has served that long. Again, that the served is the wrong word. For 27 years, this man has held sway over these tens of billions of dollars in research. He has never allowed $1 to be used to research alternative theories to the single pathogen theory of AIDS. So much is he in control of what the public thinks about this. He comes out in his little white medical coat and becomes the friendly face of the HIV equals AIDS. And he is the person right now who is promoting this idea of these dangerous drugs as prophylaxis for HIV negative. And at this point, we probably should just explain what an HIV test is. It's not a test for a virus. It's a test for a set of proteins that can be found in the blood and caused by up to 70 different bodily conditions. You can get a flu shot, end up being tested positive for a reactive for these proteins. And Gallo found these proteins in blood samples of about 45% of the blood samples he had of AIDS victims, not even half. And that became the source for this so-called HIV test, which was a blood screening test for the American Red Cross, really. And then all of a sudden, this test for proteins became a test for active virus. Well, they claim that these proteins come from antibodies. Well, antibodies protect the body. As Luc Montagnier just 4 years ago said, the body can rid itself of HIV in 2 or 3 weeks if you have a good immune system. That's
you have to wonder what he was up to when he said that.
I think this is a man who has been trying to tell part of the truth for about 30 years.
Yeah, but
doesn't have the courage to tell the whole.
A part of it's not enough, Terry. He needs to tell all of it.
And I think, he's 76 years old. I think he just got the Nobel Prize for discovering HIV. I don't think we're going to find the truth from this aging, very good scientist. And we certainly aren't not going to get it from Robert Gallo. He's been investigated by the NIH. He was investigated by a congressional committee. He was investigated in a journalism piece. The man is just simply unethical. And it was obvious he was unethical. But he had a partner in crime in Fauci at the NIH, Bobby and Tony. They just celebrated their 25th anniversary of their discovery of the probable cause of HIV 2 years ago. And coming up here in just about 1 month is the annual World AIDS Day on December 1st each year. I call it World Afraids Day.
Are you going along?
We were hoping to have that conference that I was going to.
I know.
Starting December 1st. I actually 2 years ago went to see Fauci talk to a group of his acolytes at one of these World AIDS Day events. And I confronted him and, he said, oh, it's deja vu all over again. It's like the old days when I was challenged by ACT UP. He had an audience being fed a free lunch, about 100 people at the gay rights group auditorium here in Washington, D.C. And, I could tell I was making absolutely no headway with anyone. This is, it is extremely frustrating. And I think a lot of people have been sort of worn out by this fight for the last couple of decades, a lot of rethinkers. And so I consider myself sort of new blood, even though I'm 64, coming along here, trying to do some work on this, because a lot of the people who started early on this in the 1980s or 1990s have simply been worn out by it, thinking that eventually the truth would get through. But once again, fear and greed get in the way of people opening their minds.
So what do you think is a true way forward? Because for me, I'm currently leaning towards Dr. Giraldo's view. He talks about 5 stressors. I think it's 5 stressors which are responsible for HIV diagnosis, HIV positive diagnosis.
Yes, I think, the fact is that is one of the problems. There are so many different theories out there among rethinkers. And because this is such an amorphous group around the world, there is no, and because frequently many of them in this group are kind of at war with each other, it becomes difficult to make a general case that how could so many have been so wrong for so long? It's trying to reach, in my view, a younger generation of gay men and African Americans who are being sold this lie. And that is my hope. What I intend to try to focus on in Washington, D.C., which again, there in Washington, D.C., this is the epicenter of this lie. There are almost 100 HIV/AIDS nonprofits. The rest of the world calls them NGOs. We call them nonprofits. And the Washington Post, in October of 2009, I think it was, did I think about a 10-month investigation of these nonprofits. And they found that of $80 million in government funds that went to these 100 nonprofits, 25 million could not be accounted for. We have almost 10,000 nonprofits in America right now that have something to do with HIV or AIDS. They have payrolls, huge payrolls. They collect unbelievable amounts of money. Still, to this day, even though we see almost nobody dies from AIDS in the United States now, there are some claims of numbers. If you have an HIV positive test and you get hit by a bus, you're counted as an AIDS death. Right now, maybe 12, 13,000 deaths in the United States, and 40 or 50,000 new cases of HIV. Contrast that with Canada. The United States is the only country in the world that says you can be said to have AIDS based on T cell counts. The rest of the world says you have to have a presenting illness. Well, in 2008, in Canada, their version of the Centers for Disease Control came up with 238 new cases of AIDS in a country of 35 million people. That's about the number of people struck by lightning or hit by trucks. It just isn't there. It hasn't been there since the late 80s or early 1990s when it started leveling off. When behaviors were changing that ended some of these multi-factors. For example, Kaposi sarcoma, we don't see it anymore. It's pretty clear that it came from probably a new herpes virus, and that was circulating among gay men. There are explanations for all these things, and my hope is to get through to a younger generation of gay men.
And how are you going? Sorry, and how are you going to do that primarily, Terry?
Well, I think it almost has to be almost in the way ACT UP did it, but without the drama. Going to meetings. For example, there's a meeting here of a group planning for the International AIDS Society conference in Washington in July of next year. This is the first time in 20 years that the International AIDS Society will be holding its conference in the United States because the United States lifted its ban on HIV positive people entering the country. And so the International AIDS Society decided it wouldn't hold its meetings here anymore. Well, we are expecting between 10 and 20,000 people coming to this conference. Now, think about that. That's just a fraction of the number of people who, quote, research this problem. People, 100,000 people at least make their living off of HIV/AIDS. So I'm intending to go to this meeting of this little group of I think, probably young gay men who are planning for the conference next year. And I'm going to just simply sort of insert myself into their discussions. It will be difficult. I tried this already there's a gay center in Washington. I called the executive director and I asked if I could make a presentation, and he said no. He denied me the opportunity to. I'm not just a guy off the street. I mean, I have run a mainstream journalism program. I've had a successful career, and I've studied this, but that's how difficult it is. Can't even get a hearing on a one-on-one hearing. It is frustrating, and I'm just hoping that I can stick it out and not get too frustrated, because If you put this in time, it's been 25 or 30 years, and a lot of lies are told that last for decades. So, and I'll continue to write on this, continue to attempt to get published in mainstream media. I'll continue to try to talk to people I know in mainstream media and get them to reassess their reporting. I tried to do some of that. I wish I had a really good answer for you on how to break through.
We're all trying in our own ways, I guess.
And I think it is incremental, and I think eventually the truth will be told. I can't remember who it was. Somebody joked about how certain paradigms in science wouldn't change until the people who invented them died. We may have to outlast the bastards. It's hard to know.
That shouldn't be too hard, judging by the age of some of them.
Well, that is it is there is some truth in the fact that as long as the perpetrators of this lie are still out there and still being honored and still being given grant money, Gallo, for example, just got $25 million for work on a vaccine. Here, they've been working 25 years trying to find a vaccine. Well, how do you make a vaccine to something for which the test is for antibodies? The body has already made the vaccine if they're against this harmless non-pathogen. Yet the money still is. I just saw today on the internet a grant from the Alcohol Abuse Institute at the National Institutes of Health for $2.6 million to a Florida university to study HIV positive women who use a lot of alcohol. You attach the word HIV or AIDS to any grant application, and the money just pours.
Yeah.
It's stunning. But again, we're talking fear and greed. We're talking sex equals death. And when you put that much emotion into people's minds, and when you have these mantras about safe sex and protection, this has done a great deal of business for Trojan and other condom companies. It's sort of, as well as all the nonprofits that are formed. We have a group in Washington called Food and Friends. It was started about 28 years ago to give meals to men suffering from the diseases of immune deficiency. The executive director of that small nonprofit now makes $350,000 per year running a Meals on Wheels program. Just as one example of how people are getting rich off of this lie.
Yeah, many examples. Getting back to Gallo, doesn't he get a percentage for each HIV test that's administered? Or depends on the test, I guess.
Yes, he as the person who patented the test, even though it was done as a government researcher, there as an alleged incentive for government researchers to work harder, they were allowed to have a certain small percentage of the gains made from anything patented. In fact, that's what led to this lie being called the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. Gallo had called it HTLV3, an acronym, a play on the acronym he was using for HTLV1 and 2, the non-cancer retroviruses. And Montagnier was calling it the LAV, lymphadenopathy-associated virus. And as part of the agreement between the U.S. and French governments in 1987, when they decided to agree that both of them had discovered it at the same time, what they were really trying to do was to protect the huge profits made from the patent of the so-called HIV test. So the French and U.S. governments gave it a different name, and that's how we got HIV, from HTLV1 or HTLV3 and LAV. It became HIV, and now it's become HIV AIDS, and it's no longer AIDS. It's now called HIV disease. And it is the levels of the lie just keep growing, piling up, and again goes to all kinds of money reasons. But that non-test for a non-virus, has made hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of dollars. And then there's the CD4 T cell count that makes a huge amount of money for laboratories. The so-called viral load, as we call it, the viral load of crap test that is 99.99%. Even the mainstream HIV AIDS industry will agree is tiny pieces of viral debris, not virions that could cause anything, even if they were pathogens. So the testing community, all the physicians, all of the companies that make there's a company called Sculptura. It makes replacement for the facial fat that's lost from the use of the drugs. It's even cosmetic. The dermatology has gotten into the act and making profits off of this lie.
I was really disgusted when I saw that sculpture.
The doctor who I put on my website, who in New York, who was this very attractive doctor who gives the drugs to his patients and then turns around and markets Sculptura to them to restore their faces after he destroys their faces, and then he gives them a cosmetic treatment to restore the face.
Yeah, that's what I meant when I saw that Sculptura drug being issued for people who had no fat deposits because of the ARVs. It's really, really disgusting.
The ARVs, they call the lipo atrophy, the fat coming out of the face, lipodystrophy, redistribution of fat in the body with distended stomachs, hump backs, thinned limbs with protruding veins, chronic diarrhea. And of course, diarrhea means you can't take nutrients in. And of course, that's immunosuppressive. As Peter Duesberg called it, the drugs are AIDS by prescription. The best definition of it I've ever heard.
Yeah, they are. Would you like to tell people about something to close with?
I guess again, as someone who is 64 years old, who sort of grew up reading and didn't get his information or his truth from the incoherent messages from short attention span television or even radio, I think in order to understand this, you have to do a lot of reading because it is complex, but it is not so complex that a rational person cannot understand it. And that I attempted to do this in about 7,000 or 8,000 words on a piece I've written. And I would, not because I'm trying to promote my own writing, but because I think I did a pretty good summary of it, that anyone interested in this who doesn't want to read the 20 books or the hundreds of papers I've read, go to my website, terrymichael.net, and you'll see this special report on HIV/AIDS. And again, take a look at it, and it will summarize. It'll take about 45 minutes to read, but I think it will give anyone a pretty good idea of why we are faced with the biggest fraud and most harmful fraud in medical history. And I thank you very much for this opportunity.
I thank you for your great informative talk. I've learnt a lot, and I'm sure the listeners will as well. A chap called Eden Greyfork, who is a dissident in the UK, he flies under the radar. He was looking forward to hearing this podcast, and he said you should do something frequently with Terry Michael. So I said I'll float the subject with him, and we'll see how we get on.
Okay, any time I'd be happy to do it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay, thank you very much for your time, Terry, and have a great day tomorrow.
I will. You too.
Thanks, mate.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.